biggest ways in which the Palestinian, Israeli, Arab-Israeli conflict is mistold is reversal of cause and effect. People will say the war against Israel is because there are Arab refugees. No, it's the opposite. There are Arab refugees because the Arabs went to a stupid war against Israel in 1948 because it was more important for them that there will be no state of Israel. People say, oh, Arabs in the West Bank are angry about the wall, the fence in the West Bank. Why is there a wall in the West Bank? Because of the attacks, the butchery of the Second Intifada, the suicide bombings. So it's always a reversal of cause and effect. So what we need to happen in this moment is to have a clear link of cause and effect, action and consequences. You invaded Israel on October 7th. These are the consequences of your actions. Nothing will get rebuilt until it is understood that this ideology of Palestinianism, of no Jewish state, the ideology, not the people, the ideology has to die.
Welcome to another episode of the Soothing Semantics podcast. I am your host, Rafi Pinsky. As always, make sure to like, subscribe, leave your comments for all of your real estate needs in South Florida. Of course, it would be a pleasure if you were to reach out to me. You can follow me at Rafi the Realtor and check out my weekly newsletter to stay in the know of everything going on. Without further ado, we have Einat Wilf, who I've been looking to speak with for quite some time. I appreciate Mansour for connecting us, so thank you so much. I have to make sure to give him the credit where it's due. So Einat is a former Knesset member. So she's an author. We're going to go into her books. She wrote The War of Return, which covers the idea of Palestinian refugee status, the idea of Palestinianism in general, covering the ideas of Zionism, a book that's thought-provoking, controversial to many, as much as, our existence in the state is controversial in the first place, at least to the many people who feel that way. And I imagine there are probably accomplishments you have that I still don't know about, so we'll go into that. So I'm glad you made it back safe to Israel. I know you were stranded in Germany for some time when the Iranians were throwing their missiles at us. So Einat, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay. So to start off, when you were part of the Knesset, what were things that you were pushing? What were ideas that you wanted to implement?
I had three major areas of work when I was in the Knesset. One was I was chair of the education committee, which I happily was after I published a book about the Israeli education system that really focused on bringing back very fundamental notions of how to do education and really elevating the status of teachers. So that's something that I focused on as chair of the committee. I worked a lot on kind of dismantling a very concentrated form of control of the Israeli economy, where through a mechanism that was basically called pyramids and leverage and loans, a few families were able to essentially control much of the Israeli economy to their benefit. So I was able to promote legislation that ultimately brought it down. And as a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, I focused on what later became the key element of the book, The War of Return, which is the destructive role of UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, in essentially promoting and sustaining and fueling the conflict.
That's quite quite a lot of change. I didn't know about the families that had a lot of control. I understand, growing up in America as a Jew for most of my life, I lived in America. I spent 3 years in Israel, but I understood it to be more of a socialist country in terms of how things are run. The government definitely plays more of a role. So what did you need to do to kind of take away power from those families?
So it's
What had to
actually
be done?
related because after the inflationary crisis of the 80s, Israel, especially in the late 80s and 90s, went through a pretty accelerated process of privatization, not very different from what happened in Russia and Eastern Europe. And because the process was accelerated, what happened is that in many cases, assets that were built for decades by Israel's constructive socialist economy, where a lot of like the factories and the means of production were controlled by by the labor unions, they were essentially sold to a few families. And as a result, what you had is within a decade, a very rapid transfer of control from the state organized socialist economy to a few families. And in many ways, the next step was to bring down that element in order to really democratize greater parts of the economy.
Mm. Okay, so for people who need a little more of a breakdown, it transfers from government-owned facilities, factories, businesses. Some of these few wealthy families bought it. What was the next step?
That's
Meaning,
the
what
thing. There
happened?
weren't necessarily even a few wealthy families. That's the thing that drove me nuts, is that due to this mechanism of layered ownership, which we call pyramids, um, families could basically, with very, very little capital and mostly bank loans, they could control large parts of the economy, but they were not wealthy. Their wealth was actually their ability to use leverage and bank loans in order to control the economy and thereby essentially extract from the people, extract high rents. Essentially, everybody knows this story of when in Israel when the cellular, people would have cellular bills of two, three, $400 a month as a matter of course. So basically, you had one family who sat at the top of a pyramid. They were not necessarily wealthy, but they were able to use some deals to leverage a lot of money from the banks, and then they would pay the loans to the banks by extracting the money from those companies. And the companies would essentially extract the money from the people by the fact that they control the economy and there would not be sufficient competition. So essentially, it was a way of this actually created the wealth for the families. The families were not necessarily initially wealthy before. It was their ability sometimes, to take a bank loan against a real estate asset that even that was sometimes shadily kind of got at. And then through that banking loan, basically take over control of large parts of the economy. And then by the fact that they ensure that there's no competition, they would extract the wealth from the people and basically transfer it to themselves. So
Wow.
that's why the structure had to be brought down.
Understood. Yeah, I would still argue in the United States these things are happening to a large degree. It doesn't seem that way, but there are monopolized businesses and industries for sure. If you let people get away with it, they're going to do it. There's no question.
Exactly. In
You know?
Hebrew, or Hebrew or Yiddish, there's a phrase that says that it's not the thief who stole, it's the hole that essentially encouraged the stealing. And it's a
Right.
kind of message that says, don't like, it's too easy to look at the thief. Try to understand why was there an inducement And that's the thing, like if you make it possible for people to make lots of money by ensuring there's no competition and extracting rents from people, it's well known, and Adam Smith has already observed it. People don't really want a competitive economy. They say they want a competitive economy, but they want a competitive economy until they're on top. And once they're on top, the last thing
Uh-huh.
they want is a competitive economy. And then you see it. They invest everything in lobbying, legislation, in order to ensure that once they're on top, the economy ceases to be competitive.
So true. This feeds into human nature. Similarly to how your friends will be very supportive when you're on the way up in the journey, but once you actually get there, they're like, I don't really know. You changed a little, buddy.
And
Right?
sometimes it's true. Sometimes people do change.
Yeah. No, human nature is a very, and I you seem to have quite a an understanding of it. So now kind of shifting to the Israel well, we are talking about Israel, but specifically Israel Palestine, the refusal of the Arab slash Muslim population to accept the Jewish ruled state of Israel. So you are self-described as an atheist,
Mhm.
and one might say, well, as an atheist Jew, an atheist Israeli Jew, you might have very, very liberal views on Israel Palestine. Many atheists belong to the parties in Israel who are very pro two-state solution, who are very pro the right of return, which I think is very destructive. You seem to have, from what it seems, now you might not define it that way, but you seem to have more of a right-wing approach. Um, so how did you
So
develop these? Yeah.
So basically, first of all, you're right that a lot of the secular people in Israel, the ones who are less religiously identified or less religiously observant, if at all, the one for whom the Jewish identity is the one more of kind of nation and people, you're right that on the whole, not only, but on the whole, they will tend to cluster more in the Israeli left, and that the Israeli left for many years was associated with the idea of a two-state solution, not with supporting the right of return, and I'll explain why. But you're right that there was basically the political camp that was very much associated with supporting peace by means of a two-state solution, and because it was less religious, was divorced from any notion that um, recognizing the historical connection of the Jewish people with the land of Israel, but basically rejecting the notion that there is a religious imperative to control every single square inch that was mentioned in any part of the Bible. So, and that is indeed my political camp, and still very much, I would say, sociologically, and all issues of religion, state, liberal, social issues, even economic issues, very much my political camp. Now, you're right that as I've described over the years, like let's say it's about the last 20 years, when I describe my political journey from believing that the only thing that stood between us and peace is a Palestinian state to realizing that actually what stands between us and peace is what I've come to call Palestinianism, the ideology and identity that unites the Arabs of Gaza, the West Bank, many millions in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon in a total and complete rejection of the Jewish right to self-determination in any part of the land, in any square inch. Um, People have often said, okay, you sound more right wing, or you've moved from the left to the right, or you've changed your opinions. And at one point, I realized that I need to clarify that it's not an opinion. What I'm describing is not an opinion. I have opinions, quite a few, but this is actually my argument is that this is not an opinion. And I started recently comparing it more to a scientific discovery process. I tell people, imagine you're a scientist and you approach the issue with a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state or Palestinian control of territory in the West Bank and Gaza. And then comes the part that people seem to have just forgotten, or sometimes they just try to get people to forget, the hypothesis was tested. And because we're good scientists, it was tested multiple times. We tried to test it with different leaders in case the Palestinian leader is the problematic variable. You have Ehud Barak with Arafat in 2000. You have Olmert with Abu Mazen in 2008. So two different Israeli prime ministers, two different Palestinian leaders trying, saying, okay, a Palestinian state, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites, go. In both cases, Arafat and Abu Mazen walk away multiple times. They follow it up with murderous violence, especially in the years 2001, 2, 3, 4. And the most important thing, in both cases, there are no dissenting voices. There's no internal debate within Palestinian society about the decision not to take those proposals. So you have those data points. Then you have the disengagement, which I also supported. I should make clear, voted for Barak, voted for Olmert, supported the disengagement. I mean, I supported all these efforts to put this idea to the test because I believed it was the right one. So, I was already there working with Shimon Peres when he was with Ariel Sharon during the disengagement, all the way to the last square inch, removing everything from Gaza. And we know exactly what Palestinians did with control of the territory. So at one point, you look at the wreckage of your hypothesis, right? You're a good scientist. Every scientist will tell you they're very attached to their hypothesis. But if they're good scientists, at one point they have to acknowledge that all the data doesn't fit. And then you say, okay, I have all this wreckage. What else can explain the data points? Because the hypothesis that the Palestinians want a state or control of the territory doesn't seem to fit. And then there's a quote that I came across in my research as I was working on the book, The War of Return, and I've been using it in all my talks ever since. It's by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. If you know anything about him, a great friend to the Jewish people, he was not. And he goes to the British Parliament to explain why Britain failed, because Britain basically received a trust from the League of Nations, unanimously called a mandate to help the Jews achieve sovereignty. And it failed. It didn't fail the other trusts. It didn't fail the Arabs. The Arabs got Jordan and Iraq, and with France, Syria, and Lebanon. So the Arabs get the territories of the Ottoman Empire, right? That's what the mandates were about, but the Jews don't. So it's a failure. The British essentially betrayed the trust. So they need to explain why. And he says, look, His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, this is February 47. This is why I love this quote so much. Because in February 47, you basically have no excuses. What do I mean? There are no settlements. There's no occupation. There's no blockade of Gaza. There's no Bibi. There's no Ben Gvir. There's no Smotrich. And there are also no Arab refugees. In case anyone tries to tell the story that the conflict is because the Arabs are refugees. In February 47, everyone is in place. No one has been displaced by Zionism or anything. Everyone's in place. So, and he calls it irreconcilable when there are no excuses. And then he goes on to explain. He says, in the land there are Jews and Arabs. No one, of course, is called a Palestinian at this point. And he says, each one of the groups in the land has a top priority. He calls it the point of principle. He says, for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. Fine. And then he says, and for the Arabs, the top priority, and these are the Arabs who will later hijack the name Palestine to be known as Palestinians. He says their top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. He's basically saying this is a conflict not between two groups, Jews and Arabs, who each want a sovereign state. If that were the case, then you would say, okay, give each one of them a state. They will not get everything they want. That's very normal, but they'll have a state. He's saying we have a conflict here between one group, the Jews, who want a state, and another group, the Arabs, whose top priority is to ensure that the Jews don't have a state, which kind of makes the conflict irreconcilable by definition. Now, if you take the Bevan hypothesis, the Bevan hypothesis is that this is not a conflict about an Arab state. This is not a conflict over territory. This is not, he's basically saying this is a conflict between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting the Jews not to have a state. Now, if you take that hypothesis and look at the data, it fits. All the data fits the hypothesis. And what's amazing about this hypothesis is if you think about it, it's not judgmental. This is why I said Bevan did not like the Jews. He was not on our side by any stretch of the imagination. You know, over the years when I would post, look, this is the conflict. The Jews want a state. The Arabs, the Palestine Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. What was interesting, and you often see it in my podcast in the way that people respond, the comments people will say, yeah, you know, you're a white settler, European colonialist, you really shouldn't be here. And what I always find amusing about those comments is that those comments actually prove the hypothesis. They're not saying, oh, you're completely wrong. If we only had a state in half of the land, there would be peace. They're basically justifying why they think the Jews should not have a state, but they're not undermining the hypothesis that this is what the conflict is about.
100%. I'm just mind blown that it hasn't been understood by so many Jews and Israelis yet, though. What I have a question for you, a very direct question, because I've been mentioning this, and quite frankly, a bunch of well-known people in the pro-Israel space agree with me. But there was one young lady who took it a bit personally, and she said, "Oh, it's divisive language between Jews." What I basically said is, it seems to me pretty apparent that the overwhelming majority, both in the diaspora and in Israel, who have very left-leaning, pro-two-state, pro-right of return, or even if it's not pro-right of return, but very much pro-two-state, dismantling all the settlements in Judea and Samaria, maybe even, you know, getting them all out of Judea and Samaria, freeing all the hostages, you know, exchanging as many terrorists as need be. It doesn't matter. Just get all the hostages back. It seems to be a very Ashkenazi kind of mindset. What I mean is a very Western, very liberal kind of mindset. And I want to know if you understand that to be the case, and why that continues to be so common, especially in places like New York, where they just voted in that Mamdani guy. I'm sure you're familiar. I don't even have to look at the statistics. The reform and conservative shuls, you know, synagogues, are almost overwhelmingly staunchly liberal. They're voting somebody in that's probably going to be disastrous for the Jewish community. Why is there this naivete? Because a lot of them, both in Israel and outside of Israel, they're very educated. They're highly educated. They tend to do better economically, but yet they're just missing such a fundamental component when it comes to understanding their enemy. There was let me quickly see if I can find the quote. Yeah. Some ideas are so stupid that only intellectuals believe them. George Orwell.
So I'll actually relate it to something that is, ironically, there's this notion that is incredibly relevant, but somehow it tends to be erased when it comes to Jews in Israel, is the idea of lived experience. The idea that some things are so visceral in your lived experience that, like you said, you cannot intellectualize them away. And it also is related a bit to something that is a term that has become increasingly popular and I think is remarkably accurate, which talks about luxury beliefs, which also relates to the fact that there are certain things you can believe in when you don't actually have to pay the price of believing in them. So we'll start with the Israeli lived experience. Everything I just walked you through is a lived experience, right? I believed in something. I gave it a chance, multiple chances. I lived through the insane violence as an extended period. What the misnamed Second Intifada, which was no popular uprising, it was a deliberate campaign of butchery. It This was a campaign of butchery where Israelis literally, it was playing Russian roulette with your life merely to go out to coffee with your friends. You know, I have a colleague who says that nothing more befit the Palestinian cause than suicide bombers. Like there was nothing that was like more kind of a personification of the Palestinian cause of being a suicide bomber. But that was the means by which really they literally terrorized an entire country for years. And that was after they could have had a state with everything we were told they wanted. So everything I'm describing is a lived experience of going through that, living through that, trying again and again, only to discover that reality, the lived experience, something doesn't click. Now, if you're talking about Jews in America, I also noticed that some of, again, without completely generalizing, but just in terms of the tendency, some of the strongest, most vocal fighters for Israel, for Zionism, the ones that are least susceptible to fall for the, it's all, it's not about Jews, we love Jews, it's just about Israel, it's just about Zionism. The ones who are least susceptible to fall for it tend to disproportionately come from families who came to America from Iran, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the Arab world. Again, why? Because their lived experience is that all these places literally played the playbook of we love Jews, we have nothing against Jews, it's only about Zionism, it's only about Israel, and they know how the playbook works. You first say that your only problem is with Zionism. Then you begin to criminalize Zionism. You literally legislate against Zionism. And then you claim that the Jews are Zionists. And despite the best efforts of JVP, no Jew will ever be able to claim that they're not a Zionist because heaven forbid they just celebrated Passover, right? And they said next year in Jerusalem. And that's how the Jews are gone. So Jews whose families lived, and this is why it's not Ashkenazi. Jew, because the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, has nothing to do with it. Persian Jews. I mean, the question is Jews who lived through the playbook. So it could be Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews in Israel. It could be Ashkenazi Jews in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It could be Sephardi Jews in Morocco and Persian Jews. So it's not about that. It's about their lived experience of literally living through the playbook. So many of them describe to me that once they're in America and they see what they saw in the Soviet Union come to their campus on, I don't know, UCLA, they're like, we know it, and we're not falling for it the second time, right? Fool me once. For a lot of Jews, what you call Ashkenazi in America, the more accurate description will be Jews whose families tend to be in America at least 3 or 4 generations. Their notion or their lived experience is Tsarist and Nazi anti-Semitism. So when they don't see that, they think they're safe. So when they don't see it being expressed in the form that they know from the pogroms in Russia or Nazi Europe, then they think they're safe. Whereas Jews who have experienced the post-World War II transformation of anti-Semitism into the new respectable mask of anti-Zionism, right? Because World War II kind of discredited Tsarist and Nazi anti-Semitism. They think they're safe. And because they think they're safe, they fall for it's not about Jews, it's only about Israel and anti-Zionism.
Interesting. Okay. The only thing I'm thinking is the only way I would maybe counter is to say that the reform and conservative movements seem to be almost completely of European background versus you have Syrian Jews in America that have been here for many generations. You have some Syrian Jews, 4, 5, 6 generations here. I think even more than that. And I'd be very surprised if they hold any of these views of two states or anything like that. But they've been in America
I'm
for
not going to go one by one, but I'm giving the
yeah, yeah.
general kind of the general direction of where it is. I'm in touch with many conservative Reform Jews, all a lot of Orthodox Jews supported Mamdani because again they have, you have certain Orthodox anti-Zionist sects. I don't think the right way is to look at it in terms of Ashkenazi Sephardi. I think that the more accurate way, which actually reflects the reason, is whether people come from experiences that lead them to recognize anti-Zionism as a danger to Jewish life, or those who fall for the notion that anti-Zionism is truly a separate thing from an anti-Jewish movement.
Okay, I hear you. I hear you. This is something I want to keep researching myself, but I hear what you're
Sure.
saying. You make a very good point. It's a very good point. Now, in terms of going back to two states in general, now when I spoke to Alec Pollard, Insightful Nomad, big fan of yours, really likes your train of thought, as do I. He mentioned that your idea of a solution now, for example, with Gaza, would be to establish, you could say surrender zones. How would you coin it?
Yes. So one of the arguments I'm making more broadly, and I made it long before October 7th, is that we have pursued for too long a shortcut. And that has a bit to do with your vision of being about Western ideas. It's like we pursued shortcuts. We thought, okay, if the Palestinian only had a different leader, if we could bribe them with money, if they could see that the West Bank is doing better, it's like we could maybe give them money or so my argument is that we tried a lot of shortcuts, disengagement, direct negotiations, but all of these shortcuts, they're trying to shortcut the very difficult dealing with what I call the molten lava at the core of the conflict, which is that we are facing an enemy that is not seeking anything negotiable, but is committed to our non-existence as a sovereign people. And I understand the desire to run away from that. I understand the desire to shortcut that. But my argument is that certainly after October 7th, where we saw where it leads, this ideology, because one of the arguments I made is that I think it's been a terrible, terrible mistake that has cost many lives, ironically, to define the war as merely a war against Hamas, as if Hamas is some alien body that took over a people who had nothing to do with it, rather than to really appreciate that Hamas is merely the executive arm of the ideology, which is why there was so much euphoria on that day, because people saw Hamas realizing their vision of return, their vision of from the river to the sea. So my argument is that we need to bring, sorry, that the war that needs to be brought to an end is not a war against Hamas. We're not a war against Hamas. The war that needs to be brought to an end is a war against Palestinianism. And in order to bring that war to an end, we need to begin a process that finally, after decades of avoiding it, basically lays the equation very clearly that says, if you surrender that ideology, there is a path forward. But if you remain attached to this ideology, then this is war with all the
Mhm.
implications. We do not supply that area. We will be at war. And the important thing is also to express the notion of agency. I wrote a post, I think a year maybe ago, that over the years I found that the one concept that seems to meet the greatest resistance that I bring forward is, I call it, Palestinians are adults. Somehow, this notion that they are adults, that they have agency, that they have made a choice, an ideological choice to devote their best years, people, money, territory to the destruction of the Jewish state, is something that people refuse to accept. One of the things that Adi Schwartz, my colleague, and I, for the writing of The War of Return, we say that one of the things we're most proud of in the book is that we give in the book the Palestinian Arabs the respect of taking them at their word, of actually treating them as agents of history who know perfectly well what they're fighting for, what they're aiming at. So the argument is that we need to address this head on, and that the notion of surrender and defeat is essential for change. One of the arguments I make is that the conflict has lasted for so long is because rather than allowing Palestinians to have to come to terms with the destructive outcomes of their ideology, every time they've been saved from it. This is why I focus so much of my work on UNRWA, because UNRWA is one of the key players that has allowed Palestinians to avoid coming to terms with the price of their ideology, and basically told them, you didn't lose a moronic, unnecessary war in 1948. And the reason I'm calling it moronic and unnecessary is, of course, that the Palestine Arabs could have had a sovereign Arab state living next to a Jewish state. I mean, we don't think of it, but the partition proposal was an Arab success. We think of it as a Jewish success, but it was actually an Arab success because it reflected the success of the Arabs to get the British to betray the mandate, the success of the Arabs to close the doors to prevent the existence of a Jewish state in the 30s, and to close the doors to Jewish immigration during the Holocaust. So partition is an Arab success, but it's still not good enough, because the only success they care for is the one when the Jews have nothing, not one where they have something. So this is why I call it a moronic, unnecessary war. So rather than them getting the message, this was a moronic, unnecessary war, which you lost. You lost in the sense that you fought it so that the Jews will have nothing, and the Jews ended up having something. And that's it. You have to just accept it and move on. And rather than getting that message, and a lot of people over the years comment, yeah, the Zionist is telling the Arabs to just move on. No, it's not just the Zionists telling the Arabs to move on. It's everyone in the world telling everyone except the Arabs to move on, right? The Germans were told to move on, and the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Hindus and the Muslims and the Turks and the Greeks and the Bulgarians, everyone was told to move on. The Arabs were actually the only one who were told, no, you can actually keep trying again. And that's why we're still in conflict, because every time the Arabs are being told, try again. So
Well,
they
Einat, I
try
would
again.
argue,
Yeah.
first of all, I completely agree with you. I mean, it's just so apparent. But I would say that a large reason why they have been incentivized to not move on is because we as Israelis, we as Jews have been giving them reasons not to. We've said, "Hey, have a state from the lands that we acquired during war, that we believe that we had just as much of a history to, more of a history biblically. We won militarily. You never had an actual country in the state of Palestine. Regardless of all that, all is fair in love and war. We defeated you multiple times, and now we're offering land back to you. We're essentially saying in so many words, well, maybe it isn't ours because we're willing to give back half of it. And they're saying, well, if you're willing to give us some of it, if we keep fighting you, maybe we'll get all of it. So I actually think that to a large degree, we've actually emboldened them to think that this fight is worth fighting?
I think that's a part of it. I tend to think that more of it is not about the proposal for land. I think more of it is about the fact that we've allowed, we as Israel have for so many decades have allowed UNRWA to be funded and have essentially not taken it seriously. We've allowed so much money to flow into Gaza. We ourselves thought that they can be bought off with cash. And that was and and again, that is for me disrespectful. My
Right.
biggest criticism of the Israeli government before and after October 7th is like, give them the respect of taking them at their word.
Hmm.
They're not a toddler that can be bought with a lollipop, which
It's
means that
crazy
if
that's
you, I'm sorry?
no, it's crazy that so much of the world, including many on our side, look at them as little children with guns. Like they're just stupid. They don't know any better, you know? Give them
Yeah,
their little timeout. Give them their pacifier. They'll come back reasonably in a few days, you know, as if they don't know.
exactly.
Many of them are very intelligent. Yahya Sinwar was a mastermind. They're not we
Exactly.
people really don't give them credit that, you know.
That's what I told people like before, but certainly after October 7th, I was like, can we please stop with the poor Palestinians charity basket case? Can we
Mm,
agree that October 7th required decades of investments and economic and financial planning and years of investments in infrastructure and planning and strategy. Like you're saying, it's a perverse strategy, but they had strategy and discipline. And like, these are not a bunch of toddlers. These are a perfectly capable people who have a terrible ideology. But it's not that they're like some charity basket case. So this goes to my proposal for Gaza. My proposal for Gaza says we have constantly treated them, and unfortunately, I'm still seeing it now, as people who just need to be given, given, given. And when they will see the beneficence of America or Israel or that, they will moderate. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. They need to
mhm,
go through the opposite process, the process that Nazi Germany went through, the process that Imperial Japan went through, the process of, for the first time, making the connection between cause and effect, between the destruction that is Gaza and the ideology that they went by in order to turn Gaza into an integrated weaponized landscape. And I'm like, only if you basically tell them this is rock bottom. I gave an interview a while ago to Brianna Wu, who was in Israel, and we talked about it, about the need to actually come to terms with ruin and devastation and defeat before you change. And she brought a wonderful parallel from her own life about addiction. And she said all the people who constantly allowed her to feed her addiction, people who loved her and who gave her money and support, she said they didn't help her. I often create this distinction between doing good and feeling good. She was like,
mhm,
they wanted to do good, but they didn't do good because they kept essentially allowing her to avoid the consequences of her addiction. And she said only when they cut her off and allowed her to hit rock bottom, which is really difficult to do to a loved one, but only from that was she able to emerge, she said, and she's been sober ever since. So,
mhm,
this notion, I'm saying this should be a moment to hit rock bottom and to tell Palestinians in Gaza, you see the destruction in Gaza. This is the outcome of the choice you made, and it's a choice. We're giving you the respect
yeah,
of treating it as a choice. It's a choice you made to use this beautiful piece of land not to build something for yourselves, but to destroy what the Jews have built. So
mhm,
not a dollar comes in, not a yen, not a pound, not a euro, until you recognize that. And what I'm arguing is that ideally, there will be collective surrender. Ideally, one of the Hamas leaders or Mahmoud Abbas will surrender. But I'm aware that this is not likely. So I'm saying, in the absence of that, create an area to allow individuals to surrender, to allow individuals to escape from that group dynamic and to say, fine, we are not refugees. The conditions of entering, I call that the zone of peace, hope, reconstruction. I'm like, and only that zone should be supplied. I don't think, and by the way, neither does international law, we don't need to supply our enemy at a time of war before that enemy surrendered. You know, so
It
many
makes it
people,
impossible to defeat them. It makes it so much harder for us to actually accomplish our objective.
yeah, I call it actually anti-humanitarian aid because it extended the war and it extended the suffering. You know, people pretend as if international law was written by a bunch of pacifists. I'm like, it wasn't. If you read international law, it was written by people who understood that sometimes wars are necessary and that they need to be waged and won. And for
Mhm.
example, international law talks about allowing supply to get through. It's certainly not your responsibility. And it says to women, to children, and under the condition that it doesn't give your enemy an advantage, which we know it gave our enemy an advantage. So international law even doesn't support Israel supplying its enemy before the enemy has
Do
surrendered.
you really, Einat, do you really think that if this war was going in the other direction, where Israel was completely demolished, the world would be crying for trucks to get in to feed Jews?
No, but they will be crying to create new monuments. but
That's
but
so
but
true.
yeah, so this is kind of my plan for Gaza. It's all about finally countering this dynamic that had fueled Palestinianism for so long by essentially divorcing it from the consequences.
But how do we know? Okay, beautiful point. How do we know if, say, we set up a zone in the north and I don't know, 200,000 people are heading over there to wave white flags? How do we really do a proper search to say, okay, well, there aren't 10% Hamas in here of this population? And
Okay, so
even if
first of all,
and yeah, and even so, real quick, how do we honestly know that these people they might be actually surrendering for now? How do they how do they many of them probably support Hamas or did support Hamas. It's such a risk.
so I'll start from the end. Hamas doesn't matter. It's not about Hamas.
You're right.
Hamas merely is the
You're right.
executive arm. So the question is more broadly, how do we know that it's a real surrender? So a few things operate for that. First, in the Arab world, one of the great benefits, you know, I served in the Israeli intelligence as my military service, and it was in the early 90s. And when I finished my military service, I said that I think we can do something much cheaper, close down our intelligence agency, except the ones that are for operations. And we can do something much simpler, which is listen to Arabs publicly. I was like, they have a bizarre tendency to publicly say what they're going to do. We just do this. We're like, no, they don't really mean it. And I'm like, no, no, no. It's,
And
you
not
know,
real quick to interject. When I served in Shomron, I we used to hear the imams on the loudspeakers, and I had a friend in the army that spoke Arabic pretty well. I also had a Druzy guy that would translate for me. And it's like we let them say these things on the loudspeakers. We just let them go. We let them. They just go ahead. They're just telling their sermons, and they're the most crazy anti-Jewish things. And about how they
yeah.
have to take over. They have to just create like a khalif and all these other things, and just talking about different seasons, different periods of Islam. And I'm just like, this guy's just going off, and nothing's happening.
So by the way, when I said about, I don't think it's as much about the statehood proposal. It's much more about Israel ignoring those things on a
Yeah.
daily basis. That's where I think it is. So the book that came out in Israel just now, which is a kind of an updated version of the War of Return, opens, it's in Hebrew, and it opens with 2 pages before the forwards. It's 2 pages of quotes by Sinwar and leaders of Hamas ahead of October 7th. And it's all
Mhm.
about the day of return is here. We're coming for return. The campaign for return has begun. I'm like, they say this, and we're like, no, like that doesn't really matter. So in the Arab world, what is not said publicly is worthless. People often tell me, oh, Palestinians have told me that, Arabs have told me that. I'm like, if it's not public, it is worthless. Because also saying things publicly is indicative of societal change. So, like, if it's not said publicly, it's worthless, which means that if it is said publicly, people are taking a massive risk to say that, and that actually elevates the quality of that, which is why it's not going to be 200,000 people to begin with. So first of all, that plays to that they need to say it publicly. Also, it's not just about what they say, it's about dismantling the structures that sustain it. So for example, the condition for entering the zone, and I think this should be a condition of any kind of bringing any force into Gaza, anything, the condition should be that no one in Gaza is a Palestine refugee. They need to be taken off the books of UNRWA as Palestine refugees. And there needs to be a legal opinion issued, which they each sign publicly, that there's no such thing as a right of return, which is synonymous with the end of the Jewish state. So it's both public statements and the supporting structures. Now, you don't end it with it. You continue it all the time. You begin to introduce an education system. You basically say, okay, I'm against bringing the Emiratis in general into Gaza. My guess is that's not. They need to come to a place that surrendered. They need to come to a place that is willing to change. And then they can bring an education that says, look, you can be an Arab and you can be a Muslim without obsessing over destroying the Jewish state. You know, sometimes when I talk about Palestinianism, people tell me, just say Islam. I'm like, I'm not, and there's a reason for it. Because, first of all, Palestinianism, if you study its history, by now sits at the intersection, I say, of the worst of Islam, the worst of the West, the worst of the kind of the Soviet East. It has Palestinianism by now has integrated Nazi ideas. If you look at the Hamas charter, people say Muslim Brotherhood. It's 50-50, Muslim Brotherhood, Nazi propaganda. It has introduced the Soviet ideas about anti-Zionism. It really is at the intersection of all that. Now, the difference is you can be an Arab and you can be a Muslim without being obsessively anti-Zionist. This is a lot of what the Emiratis and increasingly the Saudis are trying to do. I argue that they're doing nothing less than reformation in Islam. They're basically saying there is a modern, positive, tolerant Arab and Muslim identity. I sometimes say that the Abraham Accords are collateral benefit. We're not the central story here. The central story is a transformation in the Arab and Islamic world. So you can have a rich Arab and Muslim identity that is not obsessively about destroying the Jewish state. Palestinianism, if you remove the desire to destroy the Jewish state, there's nothing else. So then it becomes just a regular Arab and Muslim identity, which Emiratis can help construct. So this is kind of how I see it all tied together. It has to be clear that the destructive ideology of Palestinianism is a destructive one that brings no good. And then you can begin the process of constructing a positive identity. But it can't happen without hitting rock bottom.
Okay. I agree with this. Another thing I agree with, surprise, surprise, enough. How likely, here's the toughest question, which you alluded to before for a moment. You said you didn't know how likely this would be for them to actually agree to go to these zones, for there to act. I'm very doubtful. I believe very strongly that this is simply, when I say simply, I don't mean it's simple, but I mean simply a religious conflict. It's not about land. It's about an unwillingness of the Muslim, quote unquote, Palestinians to accept a Jewish-ruled state, largely based on religious belief that this was Muhammad ascended from heaven from Barak, the winged horse, and this is it's Muslim land now, and the Jews sinned. All the history of why it's Muslim now, and the Jews don't have a right to it. And hold on, I'm just trying to exit out of this. I don't know. It's very hard for me to believe that the overall Gazan population is going to forfeit those beliefs because they're so deeply ingrained. Um, they have to. If they want any shot at peace, they're going to have to, whether they like it or not. But what do you think will be the outcome? Now we're in this war for 2 years. I mean, what's your thought of how do we get this ball rolling? Do we? I think the most ideal thing we can do, I'll say it very plainly and very directly, is for the majority of the Gazans to find somewhere else to go. We've given so many opportunities. We've been in never-ending conflict. Gazans staying there, 1 million to 2 million of them, just continues to puts Israel in a position where we just never know if they're going to continue to try attacking over and over again. It also allows for them to try to kidnap more of us. They see how successful it was. They kidnap more of us. We exchange more terrorists. It leaves the door open for so many problems to arise. You agree?
So I'll explain why I insist on dealing with it in many ways in Gaza, which is in many aspects of Palestinianism, ground zero. First of all, half jokingly, I say, as long as they go to Qatar or Algiers, I'm okay, because those countries are so anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel that a few more millions won't change. But anywhere else remains incredibly dangerous, because wherever they go with that ideology, if the ideology remains, then it will be a danger. I'll start with if they go anywhere in the West. We're seeing it already. I sometimes say, people who say that, we should send the Gazans to the West, I'm like, they don't like Jews very much, because this will be placing Jewish communities in danger, because they take the ideology everywhere. It doesn't disappear when they go somewhere else. We know from, when Arafat, not from Lebanon, went to Tunis, that was not the end of the ideology. So a part of me basically says, enough with the shortcuts. And I'm going to argue that even sending them away is a shortcut, because ultimately we have to face this ideology. And if they move 30 kilometers more with the same ideology, we're still in the same big, deep problem.
Even much further away, even if they're much further away?
Yes. Yes, we live in a connected world. They can kidnap people anywhere. It's not, I mean, we need to deal with the ideology. I don't think we can escape that. I realize the desire, but it's not, and it goes even deeper. We are here to stay here, and if, which means that at the end of the day, I say that we are damned or destined. I try to promote the vision of destined. We are destined to remain a Jewish minority in an Arab and Islamic world, which means that there's no way we can get around those issues. And again, it's why you're right that there are religious, sociological elements to Palestinianism, but like I said, by now it has absorbed into it Nazi ideology, Soviet ideology. Someone wrote a beautiful piece that Hamas are the children of Fanon, of the whole post-colonial, wash the blood of the oppressors kind of thing. So the issue is we need to come to terms with it. And I think actually by doing it in Gaza is when we stop looking for shortcuts. So I think I really think after what happened on October 7th, this is the moment to really finally address it. And I'll say even more than that, I suspect that the moment we will stop seeking shortcuts and we will start addressing this molten lava, I actually suspect that things will move quicker than from all the times that we try those shortcuts only to discover that we've only dug the hole deeper. And that's why also my tendency is, we started by talking about my work in different fields. I wrote a book about the Israeli electoral system, about education. And at one point I tried to think, these are very different issues. What is the running theme? And at one point I realized that the running theme of a lot of my work is there are no shortcuts. And I think this is the issue here as well.
Completely agree. Yeah, these are tough decisions, and I think I'm only 31. I have some I have some life experience to attain. It just seems that up until October 7th, we kept kicking the can down the road. We kept putting band-aids on the wound. We really weren't, and you mentioned this earlier. You said this
Oh,
earlier.
we did worse than Band-Aids. We scratched it. Like, as I said, we sent
Uh-huh.
dollars and cash and we funded UNRWA. By the way, UNRWA is Arabs who were displaced, right? Supposedly, no big deal. They were displaced, end of story.
Mm-hmm.
But because they were allowed to continue to kind of fuel this notion of return and no Jewish state, the fact that they were displaced did not change the conflict. So we have an experience with people who are displaced, and it doesn't end the conflict because you have to deal with the core ideology.
100%. Here's another interesting point, and this is a devil's advocate question. I have my own answer, and again, I know we'll agree on this. Why do you think it's so easy to persuade Western kids in college campuses, um, and even Arabs themselves, that the Jewish people are just these foreign people to the land of Israel? That Jewish people, Israel, are not synonymous. It isn't the foundation of our entire identity. Why are especially people that in the United States, Western kids that live on a land that was conquered, which is so ironic. The whole world was conquered at this point. But for some reason, the idea of Jews conquering land, especially land that's not foreign to them, is so impossible for people to wrap their heads around. They're so unwilling to accept it. Why though?
So first of all, let's start with a
Yeah.
bigger point that we all believe, we all believe, various stories, ideas, and, this is how we construct ourselves as human societies. So the question of how people can believe something, we all believe some things. But there's no question that this comes at a particular moment of crisis, of weakness. I mean, when you look at societies that experience a rise in a certain obsessiveness with Jews and the collective Jew, uh, the question is rarely what's wrong with the Jews. This is a question that Jews can ask themselves all the time. We have plenty of answers for what's wrong with us. But that's not where you're going to find the answer. The answer is going to be found at what crisis is the society going through that feels a need to latch on to a lot of these age-old obsessions? And one of the things that, one of the problems with Holocaust studies, anti-Semitism, is that people think, again, it has a bit to do with the question about Jews in America. People think that anti-Semitism is just what the Nazis did. And as long as it doesn't look like that, then we're all good. And very few people are aware of the ideological preparation. And I've been following for years something that I've come to call the placard strategy, because you see it on anti-Israel placards. It's the equation of Israel and Zionism and the Star of David, with every word that denotes evil, colonialism, imperialism, apartheid, racism, and then it escalates ethnic cleansing, Nazism, genocide, and the words, which are always the inversion of reality when it comes to Jews, like you indicated, Zionism is the most decolonial movement, anti-imperial movement. Jews have experienced conditions of apartheid, certainly in the Arab world, to create a state with equal rights. So after October 7th, a new placard appeared. And because I followed the placards for about 20 years now, I always see when a new one appears, like in America in 2020, it suddenly said Zionism equals white supremacy. And I kind of joke, yay, finally Jews are white. Suspiciously, Jews are white at the moment when being white is the worst possible thing to be. Interesting coincidence, right? So this is a strategy that works by equating Jews and Israel and Zionism with everything that is evil. And after October 7th, a new placard appeared that said, keep the world clean. And the great failure of Holocaust education is people might know so much about Nazism and the death camps. And as a result, by the way, they will be incredibly smug in the belief that they are inoculated. They will never fall for it, not realizing that they are literally falling for it because they are falling for the basic Nazi imperative, which was keep the world clean, keep Germany clean, keep Europe clean. But it's this notion that there is a clean world, a world of utopia, and that the only thing that stands between this terrible, messy world in which we live and the clean world that awaits us is on the other side, right? The poster had an image of a Star of David or a flag of Israel in a trash bin. So the idea is that the collective Jew is what stands between us and utopia. And the tendency of societies to believe in that, to believe that the collective Jew stands between us and utopia, is often the mark of a society experiencing a deep crisis. Um, and I think that's why we're seeing it right now.
It seems like it's always that way, though.
It's not always that way. You could say that it is a feature of Western or Islamic societies. You less see it in Chinese and Hindu societies because they did not emerge with a kind of DNA of obsession with Jews. So,
Maybe it's a replacement theology. Don't you think that plays a fundamental
oh,
role
of
in this
course.
hatred?
It's a new version of it. The replacement theology is essentially the notion that there is a beautiful world to be achieved when we complete the replacement of
Right.
the collective Jew. And it has gone through a process of secularization. I agree with you that it exists in the kind of the Western and the Islamic, or I don't know what to call the Eastern, like the Eastern Christian empires where the Soviet Union, Tsarist Russia were, but it's clearly in that DNA. But the question is, sometimes it gets to a full-blown fever, and sometimes it's like, ugh. So I argue that the moment that it becomes like this full-blown insane fever, as we're experiencing right now, is almost always indicative of the body in which the fever is taking place, of the weakness, of the susceptibility to that.
Beautifully said. So now that we're dealing with Iran, and this will be a final point. Israel did very well against its proxies. Hezbollah is largely dismantled. It doesn't seem to be a major threat to us. Do I feel that it's destroyed? No, but it seems that the Lebanese government even has now they actually have a say in something. They're actually coming out and saying things, which is pretty cool. The Houthis, I mean, sure, we shouldn't ignore them, but I don't think they're going to threaten our existence. And Hamas is battered. Now, again, I do agree in your point that it's not about Hamas, but just using on conversation of proxies. Israel's done incredibly well. They've done incredibly well in Iran. Where do you feel we need to go with Iran now? Do you feel that there is an objective goal that we need to accomplish? Is there what would victory look like? Do we have to? Does the government, does the Iranian regime need to be toppled? Is there a certain amount of military installations or weapon silos, depots that need to be destroyed so they can? Where do you think we should go now? What do we need to do?
So as you can see, I constantly talk about ideas and the way that ideas shape behavior. Um, so nuclear, ultimately, let's agree, it's a 70, 80-year-old technology. At this point, it's public. So the issue is not the nuclear per se. The problem is a very powerful country and regime that have an ideology of death to Israel. You know, throughout this and many years now, I would joke, look, like the war with Iran is not a war over, you know, we don't share a border, we don't have an argument about some 3 islands in the Red Sea. The argument is that they say death to Israel and we refuse to comply. I'm like, so basically that's the source of the conflict. So if you're saying what the end game would be, is enough with the death to Israel. You know, when they say death to America, American can be like, whatever, right? It's separated from the world by 2 oceans. It's massive. It's like, you know, Iran can say death to America and American can broadly ignore it. When Iran says death to Israel, you know, it does get a little more
I would
personal.
say, though, one thing I would say is we do have American soldiers in parts of the Middle East. They also can't necessarily beat us militarily, but they can definitely terrorize the US. They can send
Oh,
sleeper cells in. Yeah.
I'm not saying they can't cause damage, but by and large, it's not likely that they can bring a death to America. Whereas a death to Israel is sadly more in the cards. I mean, they said it very clearly. Israel is a one-bomb country. It's not that they didn't say that. So the issue, and again, that's the same thing that I talk about the Palestinians and even a bit with Lebanon, but we need to stop looking only at technicalities, which is, do they have 300 of kilograms of highly enriched uranium or not? I'm like, you know, the Iranian regime could tomorrow say, you know what, we're done with the nuclear program. AI, you know, it's, I don't care with which technology they kill us. It's like, I must say that broadly speaking, that's kind of less my concern. My concern is that this is their motivation. The same with the Palestinians. I mean, like, that's why I said it's not about Hamas. I'm like, as long as this is their motivation, they will figure out a way. So so my problem is the motivation. So I think whatever diplomacy, everyone is now talking a new Middle East, and there's going to be a new Abraham Accords, and there's going to be new agreements, and President Trump wants to move with some kind of diplomatic agreement with Iran. I'm like, great. Can we actually put on the table the key motivation, which is the ideology? And and that has to end. So maybe it needs to be ended with the regime falling, which I always say that the good news is that if you look at the history of supporters of Palestinianism, every sponsor of Palestinianism, from the Nazis to the Pan-Arabists to the Soviets, and I would argue to the mullahs, ended up in the dustbin of history. And I'm not making a theological argument. I'm saying that it is the natural consequence of supporting a destructive ideology. Because if all you're doing is obsessing about destroying what the Jews have built, you're not going to build a wonderful society for your people. This also goes back to what's happening in America. So I'm like, yeah, they will find themselves in the dustbin of history, hopefully sooner rather than later, and hopefully without causing further damage to us. But clearly, the issue at the end is destroying the ideology. And this is why the Abraham Accords are also important. If we're talking about expanding them, they need to be expanded based on the Emirati model and not on the Egyptian model. The Egyptian model, which we need to stop celebrating, is a model where we gave the entire territory for peace, and we got no more than what we got with Syria, where with Syria we kept the Golan Heights, which was essentially no war on that border. We got the same thing. Egypt, the number one producer and promoter. Now Qatar and Turkey have taken over. But for years, Egypt was the number one producer, promoter of the worst anti-Semitic content in the Arabic language. I sometimes say that we're still paying the price for the fact that the Arabs were not denazified and were somehow able to escape the process. So this should not be the model. The model should be the Emiratis, Dubai, new education, the Abraham area with a church and a mosque and a synagogue. We need to insist that whatever is the diplomatic path forward, it looks like the Emiratis and not like the Egyptians.
I completely agree. It's very true. I don't think giving away land that you win through military victory actually solves anything.
By the
Because
way, it used to be understood that, and this is where Begin is totally to blame. It in 74, 75, Egypt had already agreed to end wars with Israel, like Syria, and this was only in return for a small sliver of the Sinai.
Mhm.
And the notion that peace demanded handing over the entirety of it basically was, I agree with you, not necessary, and ultimately created an impossible and an unprecedented. Like in other conflicts, it's been always understood that sure, you can you will have new lines, new borders, and the new borders will reflect some new land to the victors and conquerors. Maybe some land will be given back, but the notion that 100% needs to go back is
it's
unique to us.
asinine. Yeah, 100%. Only Jews, we're the only people. I guess we're not very good at conquest. That's the funny thing. Everyone likes to call us these
We're terrible.
colonial conquer everything. Greater Israel. It's like, dude, the country, you
Yeah,
have to zoom in on it. Yeah, on you can't even see the thing. You have to zoom in on it. We're such hungry conquerors.
even now in
Boy.
Gaza. Yeah, even now in Gaza, from the beginning, it was somehow immediately understood that no matter what the Gazans did, no matter how euphoric they were, no matter how supportive they were of what was done on October 7th, they will, at the end of it, keep the entirety of the territory. Why? Why was
Yeah,
that taken as an assumption where it's not an assumption in any other conflict?
100%. No, I'm of the belief that some land should be taken because that disincentivizes. What is the opposite of incentivize?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm asking.
Like initially when I spoke of dividing Gaza, I said, I'm saying now it should be divided into three. A northern third, which should be annexed to Israel. I'm completely against settlements in the sense that as a domestic issue in Israel, I say sovereignty before settlements. Like enough with this, like you think this should be
100%.
this should be land that belongs to the state of Israel, pass a law in the Knesset. If you don't, then enough with all this like games against the IDF. So a
I am
third,
so in agreement. That's what the West. Do you believe that the West Bank should be fully annexed at this point?
I don't think fully, but I'm not opposed to some of it. And again, I think I give people the example of East Jerusalem, which personally I think it was terrible. And the last thing Jerusalem is united, and to annex 32 Arab villages and call them United Jerusalem forever was a terrible idea. We should have just annexed the 6 kilometers of the old city and its surroundings, but whatever. I'm saying in terms of human behavior, even though nobody, not even American, even though nobody recognizes the annexation of all of that, of what is now East Jerusalem, the fact is that Jews who live in neighborhoods who have been constructed in that territory, they behave like normal citizens of Israel. They don't go down at night and engage in violence. But when you create areas that I call them areas of what was that TV series, Twilight, of Twilight sovereignty, right? Like it's sort of under Israeli control, but it's not really Israeli sovereign territory. You're actually also in creating twilight behavior. So, like I'm saying, seriously, if there are areas in the West Bank that should be part of Israel, pass a law in the Knesset. Even if nobody recognizes it, the fact that the state of Israel says this is proper sovereign Israeli territory means that the people who live in that are more likely to behave like normative people than if you create these kind of twilight zone areas of sovereignty.
Beautifully said. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Are there any points that we didn't cover that you'd
I
like to
know, I
cover?
think broadly we're there.
I think it's I not surprised that this was I really had an amazing time. I learned from you as always. Thank you for giving me the time to cover all these topics. They're definitely not easy topics to discuss, but of course I know you don't shy away from the difficult conversations. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to listen to my conversation with Einat Wilf. Of course, you should definitely check out. How many books do you have now at this point?
A few, but in English, I would say the two most important ones are The War of Return and We Should All Be Zionists, which is a collection of essays.
Right, that's one of your other ones. Okay. So make sure to check the books out. I imagine they can be found on Amazon and all places
Exactly.
books are sold.
Everywhere
All
you
right.
get your
There you go. Okay. So, guys, you can also find Einat on social media, Einat Wilf on social media. On Instagram, I'm going to drop all of your social media links in the description so people can find you. If there is any way to support your work financially, I have my Buy Me a Coffee link. Is there Patreon or do you use any other kind of buy me a coffee?
No,
Anything like that?
no. But
Okay.
people, as long as people listen and share, that's wonderful.
Okay, that's fine because I always like to, some people do it.
Oh, that's
Uh,
lovely. You're right.
yes, guys, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Smash the like button, leave your comments. It would be an honor if you did. And that is a wrap of episode 222 of the Soothing Semantics podcast. See you next time.